At the end of the day, punishing people who are experiencing homelessness does not get people housed, right? And the only solution to homelessness is housing. And not only is it not effective, but it makes people's lives a lot worse. Like I said, it pushes people around, it like costs people money, and these are people that already like are very having to move around all the time and most likely don't have any money or a lot of money to pay these like fines or fees and don't have the bandwidth to like show up at these court appointments, right? So it's like if you get a ticket or some sort of citation and in response to that you have to show up to court, like that's like putting if someone doesn't show up to court, then there are consequences to that, right? And when you are living homeless, it's a lot harder to show up to court for a lot of different reasons. And so say you don't show up to court, like maybe something that started as civil, like now you have a criminal record. Maybe something that started without a fine, now you have a fine. Or maybe now you have a late fee, and the barrier just keeps getting higher and higher and higher to get yourself out of a situation that in most cases you don't have any choice but to be in. And similarly with sweeps, like when someone comes through the city, right? The city comes through and sweeps out someone's belongings. Like there's not always really good notice. There's not always good like measures taken to make sure that people's stuff is being protected. Like theoretically, the city's supposed to store people's stuff, but there's been instances where the city's version of storage was in a dumpster, right? Or the stuff is actually inaccessible, or you need an ID to get it back, and maybe one of the things that the city swept was your ID, right? And losing an ID creates so many problems. Like you need IDs to access certain benefits, you need IDs if you're trying to get a job, like all of these things. There's been instances, like so many recorded, where people lose IDs and sweeps. They lose necessary medication. I've heard of like cases where the city has swept away someone's like limb that they needed, like they used a prosthetic limb and the city just threw it away. And criminalizing, right, like it costs money, it further marginalizes people, it creates criminal records, and all of those things are going to make homelessness worse. Right, so criminal records are a barrier to jobs. They're a barrier to accessing shelter. A lot of shelters have requirements, like you can't be in the shelter if you have a record or if you have a pet or whatever. There's different barriers, and a criminal record is definitely a barrier to shelter. Government programs, there are still requirements, like you can't get certain types of funding or aid or benefits if you have a criminal record. Um, and those rules don't even speak to like what type of criminal record, right? Because it's like if you look at someone's record for the purpose of assessing if they qualify for benefits, it's do they have a record or don't they, right? And it doesn't consider that maybe this started civil and now it's criminal, or maybe this person had no choice. A case called Martin v. Boise, and it kind of like changed the whole entire game for criminalization of homelessness. It's a Ninth Circuit case, so Washington follows it, and it basically said that punishing people who are like who have no other choice but to exist in public for necessary life-sustaining activities is a violation of the Eighth Amendment, which is cruel and unusual punishment. Um, and so a lot of times when cities then are like, okay, well, we can't straight up say we're going to criminalize homelessness. It's illegal to be homeless, which cities have done before, but now they're like trying to get a little more creative about it. And so, for example, Mercer Island just passed a bill that effectively criminalized homelessness on Mercer Island. Like they're like, if you are sitting or sleeping or whatever on the sidewalks, then we can like ask you to leave, we can make you move, which would be a violation of Martin v. Boise, except for that they say, oh, well, we pay these shelters in Shoreline, we pay these shelters to reserve spaces for us, so you always have a reasonable alternative, so you always can go somewhere. And not only does that ignore like autonomy of being a human being and like having choice. Not only does it ignore the fact that some people might not be qualified because of barriers, but it also ignores that like the CDC guidelines right now, right? And that for some people, like congregate shelter isn't a good option, and congregate shelter still isn't housings. I don't know, it's all kind of cyclical, right? Like if you are homeless, you are more likely to face criminalization, and that's more likely to keep you homeless.